In the winter of 1943, as snow fell quietly over the fields of France, a group of captured German soldiers stood behind barbed wire, silent, disoriented, defeated. But it wasn't the humiliation of capture that stunned them. It wasn't even the sight of their captors' abundance. Fresh uniforms, cigarettes, or white bread. It was a vehicle, small, square, and almost plain in appearance. Its engine purred like a restless animal. Soldiers called it the Jeep. They watched as American mechanics worked on it, quick, confident, almost casual. A tire changed in less than a minute. An engine swapped in an hour. One soldier whispered, half to himself, half in disbelief, "Sie bauen sie schneller als wir Fahrräder machen." They build them faster than we build bicycles. At that moment, something broke, not in metal, but in faith. The Jeep was not just a machine. It was a revelation. A symbol of something larger, something that neither artillery nor ideology could destroy. Industrial will. To the Wehrmacht, who had lived through years of scarcity, precision, and discipline, the American Jeep seemed almost impossible. In Germany, every vehicle was built by craftsmen, measured, inspected, and assembled with care. In America, vehicles were built like waves, thousands, ceaseless, unstoppable. In Toledo, Ohio, the Willys Overland plant could turn out a Jeep every few minutes. Sparks danced in the air. The sound of hammers echoed day and night. Men and women worked in shifts, covered in oil and soot, yet smiling for cameras that called them soldiers of production. While German factories hid under camouflage nets and worked under blackout orders, American plants glowed through the night. The arsenal of democracy was not just a slogan. It was a storm made of steel, gasoline, and faith in mass production. Every bolt tightened in Detroit echoed across the Atlantic. Every shipment of spare parts that landed in North Africa gave birth to another story of survival. The Jeep became the heartbeat of that storm. In the deserts of North Africa, its tires left tracks beside British trucks and French tanks. In the forests of Italy, it climbed over mud and shell craters, carrying generals, medics, and wounded men alike. To American soldiers, it was freedom on wheels. To their enemies, it was something else entirely, a reminder that no matter how brave, how disciplined, or how technically skilled they were fighting a nation whose factories could outbuild their courage. One of the German engineers, captured near Kasserine, was later interviewed by Allied intelligence. He said, with the weariness of a man who had seen too much, "We thought we understood modern war. We were wrong. You Americans wage it like an industry. We, like an art." There was truth in that. Germany built its war with hands, America with machines. The difference was time. And in war, time is blood. Think of the contrast. In German workshops, men in aprons measured each gear with calipers, whispering about shortages of steel. In American factories, women in overalls guided roaring presses that shaped dozens of gears per minute. While one nation crafted each rifle like a clock, the other produced thousands as easily as it baked bread. Behind every Jeep rolling across Europe was not just steel. It was the collective heartbeat of a continent-sized factory floor. A captured German private once described the moment he saw an endless convoy of Jeeps rolling toward the front line in Normandy. He said it felt like the earth itself was moving. What he didn't know was that each Jeep had a story, built from the hands of farmers' daughters, welders, and engineers who had never seen a battlefield, but who fought in their own way, by ensuring no soldier would ever be left stranded. In the great story of World War II, the Jeep was not the loudest weapon, nor the most deadly, but it was the quietest symbol of something more enduring, a nation's ability to turn belief into motion. And for the men who saw it for the first time, covered in mud, dust, and victory, it was not just a vehicle. It was the realization that they were no longer fighting another army. They were fighting a machine that built machines. By 1941, the world had become a factory of war. Every nation was building tanks, planes, ships, rifles, but only one was building without fear of running out. The United States had not yet entered the fight, but its furnaces were already awake. Steel mills in Pittsburgh glowed like sunrise. Railroads screamed through the night, hauling iron, rubber, oil. In Chicago, in Detroit, in Toledo, the heartbeat of American industry began to shift. Civilian assembly lines, once producing cars, tractors, refrigerators, were torn down and rebuilt. Now they would forge war. At the same time, across the Atlantic, Germany's empire was tightening its grip. Europe had fallen. France had surrendered. The Reich stretched from the Channel to the Volga. Hitler's armies were victorious, but victory carried a hidden cost. German production was vast, but fragile. The Wehrmacht relied on limited resources, on hand-fitted machinery, on the precision of artisans who still built by touch and instinct. They had engineers of genius, Porsche, Henschel, Messerschmitt, but they had no margin for waste. Every tank was a masterpiece. Every engine, a work of art. And art takes time. Time that war would not give. While German factories focused on perfection, America focused on multiplication. Henry Ford, the man who once built the Model T, stood before his engineers in 1940 and said, "We must make war machines as we once made automobiles, by the thousands." The government called it the arsenal of democracy. It was more than propaganda. It was prophecy. When the call came to design a light reconnaissance vehicle, fast, simple, durable, the answer was the Willys MB, a machine not of luxury, but of logic. It had no curves, no excess, no vanity. Every bolt was standardized, every part interchangeable. The blueprint fit on a single sheet of paper. Within months, it went from concept to convoy. By 1942, the Willys Overland plant in Toledo, Ohio, ran 24 hours a day. Workers in denim and goggles moved in rhythm to the machines. Sparks fell like stars. The air was thick with smoke and heat, but spirits were high. Posters on the walls read, "Every Jeep is a soldier's life," and that was no metaphor. Each one rolled off the line ready to serve, in deserts, jungles, and bombed-out cities. Across the ocean, German officers began to notice. In the intelligence reports, they called it the American Flood. Trucks, tanks, planes, in numbers that defied imagination. One Luftwaffe analyst wrote bitterly in 1943, "They do not produce, they reproduce." While American factories grew stronger with each passing month, Germany's were beginning to starve. Allied bombers pounded the Ruhr, Hamburg, Cologne. The sky over Europe turned gray with smoke. Skilled workers were drafted to the front. The rest were forced laborers, Poles, Czechs, French, working in fear, exhaustion, and silence. Every bomb that fell on a factory in Essen delayed a panzer. Every convoy sunk in the Atlantic starved another frontline unit. Yet still, the American conveyor belts did not stop. By 1943, the numbers told the truth that propaganda could not hide. America produced over 600,000 Jeeps, 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of shipping steel. Germany could not match it. It wasn't a matter of will, it was math. In the war of machines, arithmetic was destiny. And yet, it wasn't just numbers. It was people. People like Martha Gray, a 22-year-old riveter from Ohio. She had never left her hometown, never seen a battlefield, but she built over 100 Jeeps with her own hands. Her brother fought in Sicily. She said once in a letter to him, "I don't know where you are, but when you drive, maybe it's something I touch that's keeping you alive." That was the soul of the arsenal. Unseen, unspoken, but everywhere. On the other side, in occupied France, a German mechanic named Otto Klein struggled to keep a half-crippled Opel staff car running. No spare parts, no rubber. He scavenged metal from wrecks, melted scrap, and prayed the next shell wouldn't find him. He, too, was a craftsman, proud of his work, loyal to his country. But when he was captured in 1944 and saw rows of Jeeps rolling from Allied ships onto Normandy's beaches, clean, new, identical, he said nothing. He only watched. The sight spoke louder than any slogan. Behind every jeep that crossed the ocean was a truth few German soldiers could comprehend. A nation that had turned every kitchen, every school, every farm into an extension of the front line. A people who built freedom not just with guns, but with hands, machines, and belief. The American Jeep was not designed to be beautiful. But when it rolled across the mud, past the wreckage of empires, it carried something more enduring than beauty. It carried inevitability. His name was Harold Bentz. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't carry a rifle. But in 1942, when the Willys Overland plant began running day and night, Harold was one of the men who never left. He was 34 years old, a machinist from Toledo. He had worked with engines all his life, tractors, trucks, the early Fords. When the war began, his younger brother enlisted in the army. Harold wanted to join too, but the draft board said no. Your hands are worth more than your trigger finger. And so, while his brother crossed the Atlantic, Harold went to war inside a factory. Every night, the factory was alive, a vast cathedral of steel and noise. Conveyor belts rolled endlessly, sparks rained from welding torches, and the air smelled of oil and metal dust. Harold worked the night shift, calibrating the same part again and again, the Jeep's transfer case, the heart of its four-wheel drive system. He never saw the finished vehicle. He only saw pieces, shafts, gears, bolts. But he knew what they meant. He knew that somewhere, on some muddy road in Europe, a soldier's life depended on those pieces fitting together perfectly. He once said to a friend, half-jokingly, "I guess if I do my job right, some kid won't have to push his Jeep through the mud." He said it with a smile, but in his eyes, there was something else. Responsibility. Thousands of miles away, another man worked with the same hands, the same tools, but under very different skies. His name was Otto Klein. He was 36, from Dresden, a mechanic for the Wehrmacht. Before the war, he repaired bicycles and built engines for farmers. His shop smelled of oil and pine. His wife, Clara, kept a small notebook of every customer who owed them money, and every soldier who never returned to pay. When the war began, Otto was conscripted into the Army's motor pool. He was good with machines, quiet, reliable. His superiors said he could fix anything that had wheels. But by 1943, the vehicles he repaired were not machines of precision anymore. They were survivors. Engines with bullet holes, tires patched with canvas, radiators mended with melted tin. He once told a comrade, "They want miracles, but give us ghosts." That year, Otto's unit was stationed in Tunisia. The desert was brutal. Endless dust, heat, and silence. His trucks broke down faster than he could fix them. Every drop of fuel was rationed. Every spare part scavenged. And then, one morning, he saw them. American vehicles, dozens of them, rolling over the dunes. Small, square, unstoppable. Jeeps. They came like a swarm, leaping over ridges, kicking up sand. Their engines hummed evenly. Their wheels didn't sink. Their drivers barely slowed down. Otto watched from behind a wrecked Opel truck, sweat and sand clinging to his face. "What are those things?" he muttered. A fellow soldier shrugged. "Amerikanische Wunder." American wonders. They laughed. But it wasn't laughter born from humor. It was disbelief. Back in Toledo, Harold worked through another endless night. Outside, snow fell over the Maumee River. Inside, heat shimmered from the machines. The whistle blew every 4 hours for a coffee break, but he never left his station. He had received a letter from his brother, now stationed somewhere in Sicily. It was stained, folded, and smelled faintly of seawater. The letter read, "They gave us these little Jeeps, tough as hell. We drive them through places where tanks get stuck. They save lives. Sometimes I think about you back there making parts. Keep 'em coming, Harry. Everyone counts." Harold kept that letter in his pocket, worn thin from the grease and the sweat. He never replied. He didn't need to. His answer was in every part he built. On the other side, Otto was losing ground. The Africa Corps was retreating. He worked under fire, repairing trucks by moonlight. When the engines wouldn't start, he whispered to them, as if machines could still listen. When the end came, it came fast. The roar of Allied planes overhead, the thunder of tanks, the hiss of sand as shells fell nearby. Otto's last memory of the desert was the sound of engines, not German, but American. He was captured near Kairouan, his hands still black with oil. Weeks later, as he sat behind barbed wire in a POW camp in North Africa, Otto saw a small convoy of American vehicles rolling past the camp gate. They were jeeps, dozens of them, clean, efficient, alive. He watched a mechanic jump down, open the hood, swap a part, and close it again in less than a minute. He looked at the motion, smooth, confident, practiced, and something inside him shifted. He thought of the old Opel engines, the shortage of tools, the fear of failing. And then he murmured to no one, "They build them faster than we build bicycles." It was not envy, not surrender, it was realization. Two men, two hands, two worlds, both fighting the same war. One building, one repairing, both believing in machines, but discovering something deeper. That war was not only about who fought harder, but who could keep moving when everything else stopped. By 1944, the world was a storm of engines. From the frozen fields of Russia to the beaches of Italy, the war had become a test not just of courage, but of endurance. And in that storm, the American Jeep, that small, unassuming machine of bolts and flat steel, was everywhere. It carried generals to the front and wounded men to the rear. It hauled ammunition through forests, crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and somehow, always, came back running. To the soldiers, it was more than a vehicle. It was a companion. To the enemy, it was a sign of something they could not stop. June 1944. Normandy. The greatest armada in history gathered on the English coast. Over 5,000 ships, thousands of planes, and among them, 36,000 jeeps. They were loaded onto landing craft, lashed down by ropes, their tires gleaming in the morning mist. Some had names painted on their hoods: Betty Lou, Toledo Kid, Dust Devil. Names that reminded their drivers of home. One of those jeeps carried a small plaque near its steering column. Stamped into the metal, barely visible, were the letters H. Bentz. It was one of Harold's. As dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy, the first jeeps rolled down the ramps of the landing craft. Their engines sputtered in the salt water, tires slipping on sand and blood. But they moved, always forward. They pulled stretchers, towed anti-tank guns, carried radio operators through the chaos. The soldiers who drove them didn't think of Toledo or Detroit. They didn't think of the factories that never slept. They only knew that when everything else jammed or broke, the Jeep didn't. On the other side of the front, in a captured village outside Caen, Otto Klein worked again. He had been assigned to a small repair detail under German guard, fixing abandoned Allied vehicles for German use. When he lifted the hood of his first captured Jeep, he felt something strange: familiarity. Every part was labeled. Every bolt was standardized. The engine was small, but perfectly balanced. It was designed to be repaired in the field, fast, simple, logical. He turned to his overseer, a lieutenant from the Waffen SS. "Sir," he said quietly, "if we had machines like this, the war might be different." The officer frowned. "We have the Tiger, the Panther. Those are machines of power." Otto shook his head. "Power is nothing if it cannot move." In the weeks that followed D-Day, the Allied advance pressed deeper into France. Roads were cratered, bridges blown apart, fuel lines stretched thin. But still, the jeeps came. They crossed where tanks could not, carried mail to the front, dragged wounded men from shell holes. Mechanics called them mules. Commanders called them lifelines. To the men who rode them, they were simply ours. One officer later wrote, "When everything else stopped, trucks, tanks, even horses, the Jeep kept going. Sometimes we didn't know if we were following the war or if the war was following the Jeeps." August 1944, near Falaise, France. The Allies were closing the trap on retreating German forces. The roads were chaos, convoys jammed, wrecks burning, men screaming for orders. In that chaos, Lieutenant Jack Bentz, Harold's younger brother, drove his Jeep through the mud, engine roaring, windshield shattered by shrapnel. He was delivering radio batteries to a forward observation team. Without them, artillery fire would go blind. Halfway up the road, the Jeep hit a mine crater. The jolt threw him forward, but the vehicle held. The suspension bent, the axle groaned, but it still moved. Jack slammed the clutch, pushed the pedal, and the engine obeyed. When the shells stopped falling, the men at the observation post looked up to see the little Jeep crawling through the smoke. Mud up to its headlights, its driver covered in blood and grime. The radio batteries arrived. The artillery fire resumed. And that day, the encirclement at Falaise closed, sealing the fate of thousands of German troops. Jack never knew that the name stamped on the Jeep's frame belonged to his brother. He only knew that it worked. On the German side of the pocket, Otto was running on fumes. Literally. His last truck had run dry that morning. The roads were jammed with wrecks, the air heavy with smoke and panic. He saw soldiers abandoning their vehicles, setting them on fire to prevent capture. He saw a colonel shoot a driver for refusing to move. He saw a war collapsing, not from defeat, but from exhaustion. As the sound of engines grew in the distance, that steady American hum, he sat by a burned-out truck and closed his eyes. For the first time, he did not try to repair the machine beside him. He simply watched it burn. In the days that followed, as German prisoners were rounded up, Otto was ordered to help collect captured vehicles. He walked among the rows, German, British, American, and again he saw them. Jeeps, hundreds of them. Mud-splattered, bullet-dented, but still running. He touched one fender lightly, tracing the welded seams with a mechanic's reverence. In that moment, he realized something that every German engineer, every captured soldier was beginning to feel. The war they had built by hand was being dismantled by machines. Not faster, not stronger, just relentless. In the weeks after Falaise, as the Allies pushed toward Paris, Otto was sent west with other POWs. One evening, their convoy passed a repair camp where American mechanics worked under the glow of floodlights. Sparks flew, engines roared, and men laughed through the night. Otto watched from the back of a truck. The sound, that rhythm of wrenches, hammers, and engines, was strangely familiar. For a moment he thought of his old workshop in Dresden, of the bicycle wheels, the smell of grease, the sound of his wife's voice calling him in for supper. And then he whispered softly, so that no one else could hear, "It's the same music, only faster." By late 1944, the world had changed. The thunder of war was still everywhere, but beneath it, something quieter was stirring. Fatigue, doubt, reflection. For the men who fought and the men who built, the question was no longer who would win, but what would remain when it was all over. In Toledo, Ohio, the Willys Overland plant was decorated for Christmas. Paper snowflakes hung above the assembly line. Workers had painted a giant Jeep on the wall with a Santa hat, pulling a sleigh full of ammunition. But no one really celebrated. Too many sons were overseas. Too many telegrams had arrived. Harold Bentz worked that night shift again, his sleeves rolled up, his hands black with grease. The war had become routine, and so had the exhaustion. Every day they built hundreds of Jeeps. Every night, the same whistle blew. And every morning, another headline came. Allied advance continues. Heavy casualties in Ardennes. Victory in sight. But Harold didn't read them anymore. He just worked. One night, his supervisor handed him a small brown envelope. "From the Army," he said softly. Harold opened it, and for a long time, he didn't move. Inside was a single telegram. Lieutenant Jack Bentz, killed in action. France, August 19th, 1944. He didn't cry. Not then. Not at work. He folded the paper, put it in his shirt pocket, and kept building. Bolt by bolt. Part by part. But that night, when the line shut down for maintenance, he stayed behind. The factory lights dimmed. The silence pressed in. He walked between the rows of finished jeeps, each one painted in olive drab, each one identical, and for the first time, he saw them not as machines, but as ghosts. How many sons, brothers, fathers had ridden these things to their deaths? How many more would? He placed his hand on one hood, still warm from the paint oven, and whispered, "If you find him out there, bring him home." Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Otto Klein sat behind barbed wire in a prisoner camp near Cherbourg. It had been weeks since the Falaise pocket. His uniform was gone, replaced with rags. His hands, once calloused from tools, were thin and cracked from cold. But he was alive. Every morning, the prisoners lined up for roll call. Every evening, they were put to work, clearing rubble, repairing vehicles, cooking for the guards. Otto volunteered for the motor pool, not out of duty, but because it meant he could touch engines again. One day, an American sergeant tossed him a wrench and pointed at a jeep that refused to start. "Fix it, Fritz," the sergeant said. Otto looked at the hood. The letters USA were faded, but still there. He opened it carefully, studied the engine, and in 5 minutes found the problem. A clogged fuel line. He blew into the tube, wiped the filter, reconnected it. When he turned the key, the engine came alive. The sergeant whistled. "Guess you're not just a bicycle man, huh?" Otto didn't reply. He only listened to the hum of the engine, that steady rhythmic pulse. It was a sound he'd grown to love and hate all at once. That night, sitting by the camp fence, Otto looked at his hands in the fading light. They were the same hands that once built bicycles for farmers, repaired trucks for the Reich, and now fixed American jeeps. He whispered to himself, "Maybe machines don't care who wins, they just want to run." Months later, the war was over. Victory parades rolled through cities. Flags waved, bands played, and confetti rained from the sky. In Toledo, Harold stood among the crowd but didn't cheer. The Willys plant had already slowed production. The night shifts were ending. For the first time in years, the machine stopped. He went home to an empty house. On the table sat his brother's last letter, still folded, the edges frayed. He read it again. "Keep 'em coming, Harry. Everyone counts." He looked at the picture beside it. Jack, smiling in his Jeep, mud on his face, sun behind him. And Harold smiled too. Just a little. Because even if he couldn't bring his brother home, maybe, just maybe, one of those machines had carried someone else's brother to safety. Maybe that was enough. Years later, in 1948, Harold visited an army surplus lot. Rows of jeeps sat rusting in the sun, their olive paint faded, their tires flat. He ran his fingers along one of them, the metal rough, the frame scarred. And there, beneath the rust, he saw it again. H. Bentz. He didn't know how or where this one had come from. Maybe Europe, maybe home. But it didn't matter. He climbed into the seat, gripped the wheel, and for the first time, he started one. The engine coughed, sputtered, then came to life. A sound like memory. In 1950, Otto Klein was back in Dresden. The city was rubble, but he had rebuilt his bicycle shop, now repairing Soviet trucks instead of German ones. On a cold spring morning, an American relief convoy passed through. Among them were jeeps, newer, sleeker, but still with the same heart. One of the drivers, a young soldier, stopped at his shop to fix a punctured tire. Otto offered him a hand. They worked side by side in silence for a while. Then the American smiled and said, "Funny little thing, huh? Runs forever." Otto nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Forever." When the soldier left, Otto watched the jeep disappear down the road, its tires kicking up dust. He smiled, not bitterly, but peacefully, because he knew now that what he'd seen in the desert, what he'd felt in the camp, what he'd heard in that steady hum, wasn't defeat. It was continuity. Machines built by men, from both sides, that refused to stop moving. For Harold and Otto, two men who never met, the war began and ended with the sound of an engine, a rhythm of steel and faith, born from opposite worlds. One built it, one repaired it, and both learned the same truth, that in a world torn apart by destruction, sometimes the simplest thing a man can do is keep something running. The war had ended years ago, but for many who lived through it, the echoes never really stopped. The sounds of engines, the smell of oil and steel, the rhythm of hands that built and rebuilt a world from ashes. For Harold Bentz and Otto Klein, those echoes became the soundtrack of their lives. Not of destruction, but of endurance. Harold's hair had turned gray at the edges. He'd left the Willys factory years earlier, after production finally shifted to peacetime vehicles. But he couldn't stay away from engines. So he opened a modest garage on the edge of town, Bentz Auto Service. His sign was crooked. His floor was never clean. But every kid in town brought their first car there. And in the back corner, under a tarp, sat an old Jeep. Olive paint flaking, seats torn, but the same frame he once touched in the factory line a decade before. H. Bentz. He never sold it, never restored it. Sometimes he'd just sit inside it, holding the steering wheel, listening to the quiet tick of memory. 1957, Dresden. The city was alive again, in its own way. Streets rebuilt, bridges repaired. And on one of those streets, Otto Klein rode his bicycle to his workshop. The same shop that had survived fire, war, and occupation. He fixed what people brought him: sewing machines, tractors, Russian jeeps, anything that turned, spun, or ran. His hands were slower now, but steady, and every time he tightened a bolt, he still whispered to himself the same quiet prayer he'd said since 1943. Don't stop running. One afternoon, a delivery truck arrived from the local collective farm. On its bed sat something that made him pause. A Jeep. American, faded, but unmistakable. Its hood bore a dent in the same spot he used to hammer flat on captured ones. He brushed the dust away and ran his fingers over the letters. USA. The foreman said it had come from a Red Army depot, traded for scrap. They wanted Otto to make it run again. He smiled faintly. Yeah, I can do that. For 2 days, he worked on it alone. He drained the tank, cleaned the carburetor, sanded the rust. And when he turned the key on the third morning, the engine coughed, hesitated, then started. The noise filled the workshop. Neighbors came to see. Otto just leaned against the fender, eyes closed, listening to that familiar hum. He didn't see an enemy's machine anymore. He saw something human, something simple. A machine built by hands, by men who, like him, just wanted it to work. He murmured, "You've come a long way, little one." That same year, in America, Harold was invited to a veterans gathering. The local paper wanted to feature the men behind the machines. At first, he refused. He said, "I just turned bolts. The heroes were the ones who drove them." But eventually, he went, wearing his old factory badge, still polished. The event was small. A few old soldiers, a couple of jeeps parked on the lawn, flags flapping in the summer wind. A veteran approached him, shaking his hand. "You're from Willys, huh?" "Yes, sir." The man smiled. "Then maybe you built mine, Normandy, 44. Damn thing got me through half of France." Harold didn't know what to say. He just smiled and nodded. And for the first time since the telegram arrived, he felt something ease inside him. Because maybe that was what all those long nights had meant. Not glory, not victory, but survival. That summer, Harold finally decided to fix the old Jeep in his garage. Not to sell it, not to drive it much, just to hear it again. He cleaned the carburetor, replaced the spark plugs, and after a few stubborn turns of the crank, it started. The same hum, the same rhythm. But this time it didn't sound like war. It sounded like peace. He drove it down a quiet country road, the sun setting over the cornfields. Children waved from porches. The wind was warm. And as the tires rolled over gravel, he imagined, just for a moment, that somewhere across the ocean, another man was listening to the same sound. Years later, Otto sat outside his workshop, now an old man with thick glasses and trembling hands. Beside him, that same Jeep still ran, painted red now, used to haul firewood and tools. A young boy from the neighborhood, his grandson, climbed onto the hood. "Grandpa, where did this come from?" Otto smiled. "From very far away." "Did you build it?" He shook his head. "No, but a good man did." The boy grinned, tapping the hood. "It's strong." Otto nodded. "Yes, it was built to keep going, no matter what." He looked up at the gray sky, hearing the faint hum of that old engine, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, quiet, and gratitude. Two men, two hands, divided by war, connected by a machine. They never met, they never spoke, but through steel, oil, and endurance, they left behind something more lasting than victory: understanding. The Jeep was not just a vehicle of war, it was a bridge between enemies, a small, stubborn symbol of what humanity could build when it decided to move forward instead of destroy. Wars end, machines rust, but sometimes, what we build keeps running long after we stop. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled, not with relief, but with exhaustion. Cities lay in ashes, roads were broken, the air still smelled of iron and smoke. And in the middle of that silence, machines began to move again, not for battle, but for rebuilding. The Willys Jeep, born for war, rolled into a new life. Across France, Italy, Poland, and the Pacific Islands, soldiers drove the same vehicles that once led them into gunfire, now hauling bread, bricks, and medicine. In the photographs of those first post-war months, you can see them. A nurse standing beside a Jeep with a red cross painted over the old star. Children clinging to its sides as it pulls through the ruins of Berlin. Farmers loading tools where machine guns once sat. The war had ended, but the Jeep kept going, across the same ground where men once died. For the Americans, the war had proven something beyond military might. It proved the power of motion, of production. Factories that once built tanks now built trucks and tractors. Men who once measured the distance between gun barrels now measured the gap between assembly lines. In the post-war years, Willys marketed the Jeep as a tool for peace. Farmers bought them. Engineers used them to build roads through jungles. Explorers drove them into deserts that had never known a road before. In small towns, they became part of life, a reminder of a generation that had built something unbreakable. But for those who had seen them on the other side, for men like Otto Klein, the memory carried a different weight. Germany was a country of silence and rubble. The precision factories that once built Messerschmitts and Panzer engines now stood empty. Machines dismantled, shipped east or west as reparations. The once proud system of craftsmanship, the obsession with perfection, had collapsed under the sheer mass of industrial reality. Men like Otto walked through workshops that smelled of rust and mildew, remembering the hum of tools that would never start again. He often thought back to that day in North Africa, when he saw the American Jeeps cresting the dunes. He remembered the sound, the dust, the feeling of disbelief. And he understood now that the war had not been lost in a single battle, or even a single year, but in the factories, long before the fighting ever began. While Germany had built machines of precision, America had built machines of motion. The difference was not skill, but philosophy. One sought perfection, the other sought progress. And progress, however rough or imperfect, does not stop. By 1950, more than 500,000 Jeeps had been built. They crossed borders without armies now, carrying doctors to remote villages, relief workers through muddy mountain passes, missionaries across continents still recovering from war. To the Germans who saw them again, this time without soldiers behind the wheel, the sight was strange. A symbol once tied to defeat now brought food, medicine, and letters from relatives in the West. For Otto, and for many like him, the Jeep became a quiet reminder of what human hands could create when they built not for conquest, but for connection. He once told his grandson, "Machines remember the hands that made them. If you build with fear, they die with fear. But if you build with hope, they keep running." And perhaps he was right. Because the jeeps of war never truly disappeared. Some rusted in barns, some were rebuilt, some became toys or monuments. But all carried the same echo, the hum of survival. Across the ocean, Harold Bentz would sometimes stand by his jeep after closing his garage, watching the sunset glint off its chipped paint. He knew that somewhere out there, in countries whose names he could barely pronounce, others were doing the same. The war had scattered lives like leaves in a storm, but the same sound, that steady hum of an engine, connected them still. To him, it wasn't pride. It was remembrance. He once wrote, in a short note found after his death, "We built them to move men through war. But maybe what they really did was carry us through the century." And in that single line, in that quiet truth, lay the final consequence of the war. The victory was not only in who won or who surrendered, it was in what endured, what kept moving. A simple machine, 4 wheels, a small engine, a frame of steel, had outlived the men who built it, the empires that fought over it, the flags that marked its sides. Because in the end, progress itself had become humanity's only way forward. The war ended 80 years ago. But sometimes, when a jeep passes on an old country road, you can still hear it, the heartbeat of an era that refused to stand still. History often remembers the roar of victory, the generals, the maps, the flags. But what it forgets are the hands, the quiet hands that turned bolts, pressed steel, or wiped sweat from tired faces under factory light. Those hands, men like Harold Bentz, never saw the front lines. They never saw the deserts or the beaches or the cities swallowed in fire. But they built the means for others to cross them. And in their silence, they wrote a different kind of history, the kind measured not in medals, but in motion. The Jeep was never designed to be beautiful. It wasn't elegant or graceful. It was raw, utilitarian, a creature of necessity. But perhaps that's why it survived, because like the men who made it and the men who drove it, it was built for endurance. When German soldiers first saw those endless convoys of jeeps, built faster than their own bicycles, they didn't just see a vehicle. They saw a truth that every war eventually reveals. That power is not only in strength or precision, but in adaptability, in motion, in the ability to keep going when everything else stops. After the war, those jeeps crossed new frontiers. They became tractors, ambulances, school buses. They carried food instead of ammunition, and children instead of soldiers. Somewhere in that transformation lay the real victory, because the greatest legacy of war is not what it destroys, but what it forces us to rebuild. Otto Klein, the German mechanic who once called them American wonders, never knew who built the Jeep he repaired in his later years. And Harold Bentz never knew who might one day drive the ones he helped assemble. But somehow, through the noise of industry and the silence of memory, their work found each other. It's strange how two men who fought on opposite sides could share the same rhythm of life, metal against metal, breath against breath, hope against exhaustion. Their battlefields were different, but their purpose, to make something that lasts, was the same. If there is one lesson the Jeep leaves behind, it's that humanity's progress has always come from those who move, even when the world stands still. From the factory worker tightening a single bolt, to the soldier steering through mud and fear, to the engineer who designs a way forward when the old world has collapsed. They are the ones who keep history alive, not with noise, but with persistence. So the next time you see an old Jeep on a quiet road, remember, it once carried more than soldiers. It carried the weight of an entire generation's faith, that no matter how dark the night, there would always be a way forward. Because even in war, humanity never stops building, never stops moving, never stops believing that somewhere beyond the smoke and ruin, there is still a road. The war is over, but the journey never ends.